They were the heroes from the future, teenagers protecting the universe from those that would sow the seeds of chaos. Each had unique powers and abilities, and though they often had their differences, they came together to save the day as the Legion of Superheroes. Now, you can be a part of their adventures and learn the history of the future in the Legion Clubhouse. Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen, number 76. Elastic Lad Jimmy and His Legion Romances. Published April 1964. Written by Jerry Siegel with art by John Forte. The ladies of the Legion of Superheroes take a romantic interest in Elastic Lad. But do they have ulterior motives?
Girls are mean, Matthew. That's one of the things that comes out of 1964 and Jerry Siegel, who, really tried to put down Saturn Girls' leadership. This time he's just going out to prove that girls are mean to boys.
Well, in his defense, when Lucy Lane is involved, cruelty ensues.
Why is Lucy such a... Why is she such a pill?
Star H?
Why is she such a pill?
Well, it was established early on that Lois and Superman's relationship was contentious, and she, Lois, was trying to outsmart Superman and prove that he was actually Clark Kent.
Right.
When you take that same cruelty and apply it to little sister Lucy and aim it at Jimmy, it just amplifies the... I don't want to say misogyny because, it's a comic book and they're just basically being jerks, but it amplifies the negative aspects of that, and it turns her from somebody who's trying, to poke and prove a point to somebody who comes across as actively malevolent. And Lucy Lane is pretty much a B star H to Jimmy every time she ever appears.
Oh, yeah, I don't think I've read a lot of the Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen issues, because, again, they come in those giant phone books, so I got... First appearance of Lucy Lane all the way through, the late 60s Lucy Lane. And I don't think that there was a time, and I don't think there's any appearance where she doesn't come off as someone who is incredibly mean and talks down to Jimmy like he is a nobody because he's just got a menial job and makes, probably minimum wage. And anytime he tries to impress her, she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was looking over here at this fungus growing on the wall. What did you do with Superman? What? Oh, you're just a joke, Jimmy Olsen." And so I just can never get behind Lucy Lane. And when she showed up as a character in Smallville, played by a great actress, by the way, I was still, no, sorry, I cannot get into this character because I know how cruel she is.
You guys made her awful a million years ago, and now we don't want to look at her.
I guess that's what it is. I don't know. But it, again, when I hate to be mean to Jerry Siegel, but man, this guy has something about women that he doesn't like. I don't know.
I can't necessarily disagree with you, but I think that it may not be Jerry so much as a perceived audience of 10-year-old boys.
Here's the troubling thing, right? We have read in the letters columns letters from both boys and girls. We have read letters from girls saying, "Oh, this was the greatest thing. I really admire Saturn Girl," or "I really like Jimmy when he's Turtle Boy," or I'm in love with Mon-El. Maybe someday I'll grow up." And then it's signed Night Girl down at the bottom. But the weirdest thing is, at the time, and still or maybe not today, but at the time you had as many girls, if not more girls, reading comic books than boys. And when you intentionally are going after half of your reading audience and saying, "Oh, you're all mean, you're all vindictive, you're out to play around with boys' heads and make them think that you like them, when in secret you're just laughing and saying, 'Oh, what a goof Jimmy Olsen is,'" that is really alienating half your audience. And so it is not a surprise. And in fact, I think it was mentioned maybe a little bit in this interview I did a couple of weeks ago on the Major Spoilers podcast with this guy who was writing about comic shops. We had a little discussion where he kind of was saying, hey, when you alienate half your reading audience, it makes sense that comics had so many problems in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s when you started to have a massive decline of readership, because you were basically catering to a very small percentage of your readership and dismissing the rest who are out there buying as much or had as much disposable income as the 50% of your audience did or the 49% of your audience did. And this is I think this is a perfect example of doing a forearm or palm in the face of your female readers.
It's definitely, you could make that case. I would agree. Yeah.
On the one hand, but on the other hand, if you're trying to cater to young adolescent boys and you want them to be your go-to readership, this is the issue to do it.
This issue features, I think, especially pre-adolescent, but a lot of young boys' fantasy, in that as soon as Jimmy arrives for Legion duty, all of the female Legionnaires are totally into him. They are fighting for his affections. He'll do something quasi-heroic and get a kiss from Saturn Girl, and then a kiss from Lighting Light, and a kiss from Triplicate Girl. And essentially, this whole issue is, well, I don't need Lucy Lane because hot chicks from the future in spandex think I'm awesome.
And then, of course, they say, oh, no, you can't stay Jimmy Olsen. You'd mess up the time stream if you stuck around. You go back in time. You go back in time, and the minute that the boys pick him up in their souped-up time bubble and they fly off, they're all giggling and laughing, going, oh, ha, 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 we were just putting Jimmy on. No one could love a Jimmy Olsen. We were just doing this because we know that his, whatever she is, Lucy Lane, is watching on the future viewer and can see all of his adventures, and this way she'll like him even more. And then Jimmy gets back, and she's like, oh, I'm sorry. I took a nap. What did you do? I didn't want to watch a dumb TV
asleep.
show.
What happened?
Yeah.
What a terrible character.
But again, she is terrible. But again, if you're trying to really draw in the male audience, this is the issue to do it, because Jimmy doesn't have one girlfriend. He has 4 girlfriends.
He does. And one of them is the ever lovely Ayla Rance.
Yeah, it is. Light Lass, with her beehive hairdo.
And her lightning symbols drawn clearly from the point where this story was written, when she was still called Lightning Lass.
Yeah.
Throughout the issue, I just love that. This is the second or third time we've seen her appear since the name change, but still wearing the lightning emblems. And on the one hand, it feels like, oh, my brain is thinking, well, they wrote this story beforehand. And on the other hand, I'm like, this makes it feel more real. She got a new name, she got new powers, but she hasn't had time to have somebody make her a new costume. She hasn't been able to go to Fredericks of Zoidbergs of Hollywood. So it's kind of neat to see her in her Lightning Lass suit throughout this issue.
I agree. It is nice to see her do some stuff using that name. And it's also, to maybe make a broader stroke of what's going on in this issue. Jimmy gets dropped off and only the girls are around. None of the male Legionnaires are around because they're all off doing busy things. And they had to bring Jimmy in because, as an honorary member of the Legion of Superheroes and as Elastic Lad, he has to do a Legion activity twice a year, or else he's going to lose his membership. And so that's the gimmick, to get the girls to say, oh, Jimmy, let's go on these adventures together. Oh, Jimmy, you're so great and so wonderful. Let me give you a kiss. Mwah, mwah, mwah. And hopefully Lucy's back home watching this, and Jimmy, of course, gets a swelled head because he's Elastic Lad. It can stretch and be malleable that way.
Right. And interestingly, this is, I think, the first time we hear the Legion Constitution rule that the honoraries have to participate. But also, it is the last. That never comes up again.
Never comes up again.
And he and Lana are considered honorary members and in good standing through about 1987, with about 5 appearances apiece, because this particular issue is the only time the Legion Constitution's Clause 9, Subclause 12 is mentioned.
Let's flip this around and take a look at why Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen might be doing this specifically. Not just because maybe Jerry Siegel has something against strong female characters. But this is also a book that is really aimed at boys. DC really had kind of 2 books going on at the same time. You had Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and you had Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about those is it was focusing on someone who was a Superman secondary character, and the stories were targeting those specific demographics. So if you were reading Lois Lane, then you were probably a girl who had aspirations of doing girl reporter things and being really good at her job, but also secretly in love with Superman and hoping someday that you too could grow up and marry the man of your dreams. Likewise, Jimmy Olsen is Superman's pal because Superman really doesn't have a sidekick. And something that came out in, I guess, the 1940s, was it, with Robin, is that you need that kid sidekick in order to create that fantasy or that door for the younger reader, because it's like, well, I'm not Batman, I'm not Captain America, I'm not, I'm not Green Arrow, but I am a kid, and I'd sure be great to go on adventures with him. So we get these sidekick characters. And Superman really never had that, unless you want to count Beppo the Super Chimp, or Crypto, or, Streaky, or, any of the horses. So that's where Jimmy Olsen comes in.
He didn't have a recurring character, but weirdly, he had half a dozen sort of kind of not recurring ones. I mean, Supergirl took that role for a while, but yeah.
And Pete Ross did too.
The thing that's important about Jimmy and Lois's books is that they both ran for like 20 years coming out of the Superman television show of the 1950s. So they were strong enough characters to go 120, 150 issues and just go on and on and on. And the sales were strong enough just because this was a Superman adjacent title to justify their book going on and on and on. So I really, really enjoy the fact that Jimmy Olsen's solo book went as long as it did and did as many stupid things as it did.
Oh, boy, this is probably, I mean, I haven't read all of the Jimmy Olsen issues, but man, in this first 100 issue run, Jimmy is a big dope. I mean, the biggest dope ever. It's amazing that he hasn't electrocuted himself, gotten run over by a train, and drank poison all in the same panel.
And yet in this issue, he uses his stretchy powers really, really cleverly.
He does, and also a little bit scarily or grotesque for some people that have digit weirdness or freakouts, because at one point Jimmy is trying to capture a crook, and so he stretches his fingers out and encases them around this guy, and the guy's running, and so Jimmy is constantly shifting his giant rubber fingers around to create a maze that this guy is constantly running through. And so if you can imagine this wriggling mass of jelly fingers.
Stop.
Well, at least I didn't say eyeballs or weird human teeth in fish or anything.
I'm not worried about eyeballs and weird human teeth, but yeah, and he does really clever things that also touch on the fact that stretching is an inherently humorous power.
Yes, it is.
But also really gross. Stretching is gross. He shoves his fingers out and turns them into a giant finger thing. And at one point he stretches his body to replace a missing cable, and he elongates his nose to communicate with a weird elephant hybrid beast.
Swordfish
it's actually part elephant. No, it's part elephant. It's part griffin, and it's part weed whacker.
Oh, I was going to say Sawzall, but okay.
Sawzall is good too, yeah. And he elongates his nose to be incredibly disgusting, just like Ralph Dibny used to do in the 60s.
Yeah, true. And, it's interesting, there's a difference between Elastic Lad and Bouncing Boy. And it's interesting that Jimmy still gets to be an honorary member, even though he has a power that's almost like Bouncing Boy's. Because if Jimmy wanted to, he could turn into a ball and bounce around.
He could. He never does, because that's actually the power.
That's Bouncing Boy's power. So let me ask you this. What do you know, or do you have an idea or an impression at issue number 76? How is Jimmy Olsen doing as far as sales going? Is this a popular book? Is this in the top 10? Is this in the top 50, top 100 selling books of 1964?
I don't think it was ever like a top seller, but it was a book that was comfortable, because Jimmy Olsen is, it's either 76 or 77 when Jimmy and Lois's books end and are folded into a giant size comic.
Superman's Family or whatever it was.
So, the Superman Family. So the thing about these 60s issues is I think they were pretty good, solid sellers. And I think the fact that we see this Legion crossover, some people would say they're using the Legion to bump Jimmy's sales.
That's what I was wondering.
I'm not entirely certain that they're not doing it the other way around, because this is an issue drawn by regular Legion artist John Forte,
right?
Which it also has the effect of making it feel more, and there are air quotes all over this, real,
yeah,
or more authentic, because it feels like it's drawn. This is a Legion story.
Well,
I mean,
right.
Jimmy's
that goes back to
it.
what you were saying about Ms. Rands, because she looks really good. I mean, she looks like she looks like the mother that you would see in Lost in Space, or she looks like a younger version, or June.
Yeah. June Lockhart from Lassie.
Yeah. She kind of looks a lot like that.
Who is also the mother from
Lost in Space. See what they're doing there?
She looks like Lockhart, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is also, speaking of apropos of nothing, but speaking of lovely art, the Kurt Swan Saturn girl on the cover is just adorable. So cute and so adorable. And you can see why Kurt became cover guy to sell the comics, because you look at this cover and you immediately know this cover is what they came up with first. And they said, Kurt, give us this compelling cover and we'll have, Siegel and somebody put together a story. But I really, really enjoy the fact that the art here it makes it feel clearly like a Legion story that features Jimmy, that crosses over with Jimmy in a traditional modern crossover sense. And, aside from the fact that Lightning Lad isn't in this, but Elastic Lad, aside from the fact that Elastic Lad is such a spaz that he not only has to have his full name written on his chest, he actually has it written on his back as well.
Yeah.
In case he forgets who he is, coming or going.
Yeah, well, he might be turned around. His body can do that when it's all stretchy.
That is entirely true, and also, once again, very, very
So
gross.
Let me ask you this other question, because this is something I don't think it's been brought up before, because I don't think we actually read the actual issue where Jimmy got his elastic powers.
We did not.
But Jimmy's powers are based on him drinking a chemical. And that is somewhat problematic, because we have seen many people try to apply for membership into the Legion of Superheroes, and their powers rely on a battery pack or a generator, or I have to drink a fluid in order to keep this going. Now, Bouncing Boy's a little bit different, because he drank the fluid and it's a permanent change, right? Jimmy has to, if he wants to be Elastic Lad, has to keep drinking this fluid in order to be Elastic Lad. If he doesn't, he's not Elastic Lad. So again, I know honorary memberships really mean nothing as far as memberships into the Legion of Superheroes go. But it's amazing that they're like, well, you really don't have powers, Jimmy. You're having a chemical allergic reaction to this stuff that I'm pretty sure we could give to any other human, and it would have this same effect.
Agreed. And I think that we did read the issue where Jimmy joined the Legion. And they did reference the fact that he's actually a part of the Legion partly because of the Pete Ross effect.
Right.
Where he is such a close friend of Superman that he actually gets Superman's spillover and is given he's been given hero status partly because of that.
How weird. Let me ask you this. How weird would it be to either be Pete Ross or Jimmy Olsen? Because at one point, it was at the last issue or one of these issues that we have coming up, where Jimmy and Pete are both together at a Legion meeting. And it's like, oh, you were Superman's childhood best friend. I'm Superman's old man best. I'm like the new you, Pete Ross, is what Jimmy Olsen would say. How weird and awkward would that be? It'd be like running into your girlfriend, like an ex-girlfriend or something when you're with your current girlfriend.
Or even worse, like that Saturday Night Live sketch, Meet Your Second Wife.
Oh, yeah.
Where men in their 30s meet people that they're going to marry eventually, and one of them is like 9.
And the other thing is the fact that there is a 20-year difference between their timelines, right? Because Jimmy is technically a future version of Pete Ross. I mean, Pete Ross exists in Jimmy's timeline,
right?
But he's much older. But here, when he meets him, he's a kid, and that's got to be a mind trip just in itself.
Not to mention, Pete knows Superman's secret and Jimmy does not.
Exactly. That gives him the one up, right?
I think it's got to be more awkward for Pete.
I wonder too,
knowing
because
that
it's like
he's going to be replaced by a younger model in a few years.
I know, right? That's just really weird. And I forget which issue that this shows up in. It's got to be one of the upcoming ones where they're both together at a Legion meeting. But that was another one that just popped up in my mind since we're really talking about Jimmy Olsen this week and his powers of stretchability.
Stretchable power.
Yeah. Anything else you want to talk about in this issue?
This is an issue that I almost said was too tangential.
This is one that I would disagree with you with. Now, I know a couple of weeks ago, and I'll let you explain, but a couple of episodes ago, we did the Action Comics 309, and that was one that I was like, well, this is literally one of those where it's a literal tangential Legion of Superheroes one. This is legitimately a Legion of Superheroes story with Jimmy Olsen replacing Superboy. And so to me, and I can't remember if this is in the Omnibus edition or where I remember seeing this one. It may have just been Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen Omnibus.
I believe it was when you bought the black and white phone book of Legion stories a few years ago.
That's probably where it is. But I would say that this is an important Legion story.
I agree. I don't know if I would call it important, but it's definitely one that there were three things that put it over the edge. One, of course, was the Forte art that we've talked about. Because that makes it feel real, whatever that means in comic terms. Two, it has ramifications for Jimmy. And as much as continuity ramifications take place in 1964, in that the Jimmy Lucy triangle, where it's Jimmy and Lucy, and then Jimmy having to deal with the fact that he's an idiot, as opposed to Clark and Lois and Clark having to deal with the fact that he's Superman, is kind of thrown into here. But more importantly, everybody in this issue who is a Legionnaire does something legionary. They feel like this is something that happens in between Adventure 320 and 321, and it feels like this is where these three members of the Legion were last issue when we didn't see them, while the rest of the team was dealing with the Time Trapper. Even though I think at least one and possibly all of them were in that story, it felt like one that didn't necessarily have long-term consequences, but it established and deepened Elastic Lad's ties to the Legion. And I figure eventually, if we're going to keep doing Legion Clubhouse, we're going to have to deal with the fact that all of the honorary members just sort of drop off the end of the pier in 1967, never to be heard from again. So we might as well enjoy them while we have them.
Right.
If you enjoy the show, we would appreciate your support. You can find out more and become a Legion Clubhouse member at patreon.com/major spoilers. Adventure Comics number 321, The Code of the Legion. Published June 1964. Written by Edmund Hamilton with art by John Forte. When the Science Police tests the Legion's loyalty, one member betrays the team. Has Lightning Lad's resurrection turned him evil?
I think, Matthew, when we are looking at Adventure Comics 321, we are looking at the introduction, not really the introduction because he's been around now for 2 issues, but we really get a first good look, so to speak, of the Time Trapper, a villain that the Legion of Superheroes will face again and again and again for the next 50 years.
Or at least 30, yeah.
Well,
I think this is the first time we actively see him in action against the Legion instead of as a nebulous threat sometime out in the future.
So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and welcome, but also, why is this your first time? The previous 2 instances of the Time Trapper have shown the Time Trapper behind the Iron Curtain of Time, wringing his hands the first time. The second time, he actually speaks to them from behind the Iron Curtain. And this time, he actually shows up. But you don't know that it's the Time Trapper when he initially shows up.
And when they do show him, Time Trapper's costume is basically a purple monk's robe with a big hood.
And for a long time, during my Archie Legion run, it was also kind of implied that he may have been a... was it a Kulan, one of the shapeshifters? Not the wherever Cam is from. Chameleon
Kolu.
Boy. Yeah,
No. I'm sorry. Durla.
Durlan. Yeah, that's right. He was a Durlan, right?
Coluans are the Brainiacs.
Yeah. It was kind of implied that he may have been a Durlan.
At different points in his history, he's been many different people.
Different races, okay.
But the one thing he's always had in common, whether he's a controller, whether he's Cosmic Boy, whether he's Superboy Prime,
Spoilers,
is
darling.
a big purple hood. Oh, people won't remember this when we get 50 years down the line. But the fascinating part to me is in this issue, under his perfectly fitting rubber human life mask, he's wearing his purple hood. And so when he pulls off the mask of "Nyahaha, I'm not who I seem to be," it's just the back of his hood.
Well, so here's the really crazy part. So he shows up as Commissioner Wilson. Apparently there is an ultimate weapon, right? An ultimate weapon. And Commissioner Wilson, who has to be, what is he, Commissioner of the Planet? So I forget what his...
a science police officer.
Okay, so he's a science police officer, and he's like, look, if you guys know that there is a weapon out there that can destroy everything, and you guys are trying to keep it secret, I don't trust you because you're all kids and you can be tempted with ice cream and candy and stuff. So why don't you guys come with me to this faraway, secluded bunker where I can interrogate you all one-on-one and try to get the secret of the ultimate weapon out from you.
Where I can torture all of you underage children who are on Earth, probably not entirely legally. So aliens from several sovereign planets who are, in fact, children, lads and lasses. The science police apparently has the authority and the jurisdiction to psychologically torture until they break. Sunboy walks out of his session unable to speak. He's like shambling like a zombie, and Superboy's like, "What happened?" And then, of course, they call for Shrinking Violet, and Violet is like, "Holy crap, I'm going to die."
Well, she's like, I'm going to actually tell. I can't keep the secret inside. I'm actually going to tell, but she shrinks down to a miniature size to where when she says it, no one can hear. And so Commissioner Wilson's like, well, okay, I guess you can't be broken. Bring in Lightning Lad. And, of course, he cracks and tells the secret of the concentrator.
But not until we get the Saturn Girl retrospective.
What's going on there? That makes no sense.
The greatest hits of Saturn Girl. Well, this issue, the gimmick of this story is trying to discover who is, quote unquote, the weakest Legionnaire.
Right.
And they keep feeding us this little Chekhov's gun of, well, Saturn Girl's power to cast thoughts makes her the most susceptible. She might accidentally cast that thought into someone else's mind and give away our secret, super secret weapon. And so Superboy worries and Mon-El worries, and people keep worrying that Saturn Girl is going to crack. And we get this 5-page sequence of all the times that Saturn Girl came close to cracking and all of the great feats of the Legion in the past. And I'm just like, okay, we're supposed to read that and think this is Saturn Girl using her power or using her mind to think her way out of it. But we're set up to believe that she's going to snap because she's, quote unquote, only a girl.
Right. But she doesn't. She survives. But Lightning Lad gives it away. And so they're going to have to lock him away on this faraway planet where no one knows that he's at. So no one can learn his secret. But just as Commissioner Wilson is taking off to go back home and file his report, Superman and his pals go back inside and they talk with Lightning Lad. He's like, look, I was lying the entire time because I think Commissioner Wilson isn't really Commissioner Wilson.
I think he's really Commissioner Gordon.
Yeah, and so they rush back to the Legion Clubhouse and discover, sure enough, Commissioner Wilson is really the Time Trapper. It's a great little story about the Time Trapper and how evil he is. But if I'm also not mistaken, as many times as we will get different reveals of who the Time Trapper is in the future, until those big pull the mask off and everyone's like, oh, Farmer Brown, we never, ever get to see the Time Trapper's face. He's always underneath that purple cloak, and you never know who he is. So he could be anyone at any time, which is a great, great device. And even in this issue, when he's pulling off that rubber mask and you only see the back of his head, you're like, we never see this dude's face.
Yep. To my knowledge, the Time Trapper is not ever unmasked on panel until 1978.
Yeah.
The Legion tabloid, massive Legion story where Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad get married.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and it kind of gives him this element of thing. And if you look at it from the perspective of someone in 2017,
Mm-hmm.
the time trapper is basically the embodiment of weird time travel things in the future. At this point, the Legion has one future. It's 4.5 years long. By 2017, the Legion has 5 or 6 different futures, and there have been 5 or 6 different people revealed to be under the mask of the time trapper as the future grows and changes. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we've talked about in the past. This is the future of 1964, for good and for ill.
Right.
And this time trapper is the time trapper who is the future of 1964. And I like that, the fact that this was clearly not intended. There's no way they could expect this book to still be being printed 40 years down the line.
But even then, the fact that, next issue, they're not pulling the cloak back and going, oh, it's this guy. That
Right.
the fact that they
It's
keep
Farmer
using
Brown.
that kind of a Shrekish kind of or Shimpish kind of thing, where it's just like, this can be anybody. We'll just keep his face hidden and just keep running the same gimmick again and again.
Did you just make a Sam Raimi fake Shemp reference?
Pretty much, yes.
Wow, nicely handled, Veruca. I like that.
So we learn that the concentrator is basically a Star Trek replicator machine.
That creates the Star Trek device that ate the Constitution in Colonel Matt Decker.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that giant thing.
The evil cornucopia of space.
Yeah, what was the name of that episode?
Oh, God, now I can't
Was it Doomsday
remember.
Weapon? Was it Doomsday Weapon?
Doomsday Device, I believe.
That's what it is. Do we ever see the concentrator again? Because this is a big weapon that these guys have. Surely, if you're going to be using the time trapper again and again and again, surely the concentrator will make an appearance at some point when there is an ultimate crisis of some final kind that the Legion has to go up against.
Well, points the first. Don't call me Shirley. And secondly, this is the Legion, my friend. This is the future of the DC universe, the canonical future. So you know in your heart that the answer is no.
I know. I don't know why I keep asking this. It's kind of like,
never see the concentrator again. It's kept on the puppet planet with Radiation Roy.
Let's see. I don't know why I keep asking this same question issue after issue, because it's kind of like when I was a kid and I asked my parents for something really cool for Christmas, and then Christmas Day comes and I go down and I shake the box and I'm like, oh my gosh, is this the thing I asked for? And they're just kind of like giggling, and then I open it up and it totally isn't.
Yes. Yes, and then they're like, well, Stephen, we got you socks.
Yay.
But you needed socks. Your feet have grown 3 sizes.
So here's the thing. I like this as a time trapper first story. I think it's kind of cool. He's willing to torture. He's willing to connive. He's willing to disguise himself. He's willing to do whatever it takes to come out from behind that iron curtain of time and get the concentrator. So I like that as a story. Problem is with Bouncing Boy. Now,
Yeah.
so in all the times that I've said that I don't like Bouncing Boy, and I think he's got a dumb origin, I think he's one of the dumbest Legion members out there. At no time is my hatred for Legion Boy having to do with anything about his size. He's a big kid. He would go to the Chalmers Big and Tall Man store if it existed in the future to buy his clothes. So I've never had
it's actually Thornton Mellon's Big and Tall.
I've never had a
tall
problem.
And fat. You're tall and fat.
I've never had a problem with Bouncing Boy being fat, right? That's never been a thing. And what's cool about it is, ever since his introduction, he's been trying to prove himself time and time again to say, hey, I can be useful too. And finally he's accepted, and everyone's like, you actually can do some cool things. Welcome aboard, Bouncing Boy. So as we are talking about the social aspects of what made the Legion of Superheroes cool in the 1950s and the 1960s, is there's inclusion, there's equality, there's diversity, there's all this stuff that's going on. And then we hit Adventure Comics 321, where Bouncing Boy steps in front of Brainiac's one of his rays and gets turned into a thin kid with no bouncing powers.
Yes, he loses his powers in this issue. And he is basically slimmed down to I
think he's as slimmer than Brainiac.
I think he's actually slimmer than he was when we saw him before he had his bouncing powers.
Oh no, even when he was first introduced, he was a kid with a paunch. He was a chubby boy.
Yeah. And this issue really makes the point that oh, you've lost your powers. We're going to keep you on as an honorary member. You're still our pal. You're still our buddy. But it also depowers him and takes him off the field, basically. And I think that this is the beginning of some of the stuff that really bugs me about this early Legion, because we started with this expectation that these characters are going to be weird. And Element Lad is strange with curly hair, and he looks like the Campbell Soup Kid. And Matter Eater Lad has powers that nobody takes seriously, but he's still stalwart and strong and awesome. And Bouncing Boy is the weird fat kid who got rejected twice but made it in on sheer guts and chutzpah. And now they're like, but we're taking away his powers because we want to focus on these other more traditional heroes.
But does it disappoint you or upset you that they also, I mean, they could have left him a chubby kid. He could have just stepped in front of Brainiac's Ray and had his powers wiped out. But at the same time, he is now slimmed down to, like I said, he looks like a quote unquote normal kid.
Yeah. And the issue ends with the joke that he has found a new plus size girlfriend named Irisa. And Superboy is trying not to laugh at the fact that Irisa is, a heavier woman. And I'm like,
yeah. And also the fact that in the previous issues that we've seen him, it seems like he's been rejected by girls because he is a plus size person. And then the quote unquote irony is once he's thin, he does get a girl, but it's a big girl. Yeah. And so that's kind of embarrassing too. But I just thought that, he could have taken away his powers and he could have still been the chubby boy that we all know and loved. And it just seems like this is a bit of fat shaming. I'm sure that the President's Council on Fitness didn't go to DC's Comics and go, look, you got a fat kid on your roster, and that doesn't that really, you really should think about him slimming down, and because skinny kids are right on. And I don't think that that's going on, but again, there seems to be, and I don't know, we're going to have to read the letters columns in issues coming forward, because it just seems to be that the Legion of Superheroes was on a trajectory that was super positive and super future looking from a social aspect. Now, flying belts and flying rings and, stretchy fluids and all that kind of stuff aside, this was a very progressive series when we first started it. But now it seems like they're taking steps back from those progressive moments that were created earlier.
And I think part of that is the fact that we're seeing it go from a secondary feature to the lead of one of DC's major tentpole anthology books. When it's the Weird Legion and they're like, oh, well, what crazy power do they have now? Matter Eater Lad can eat matter. Invisible Kid can just turn invisible. The powers that they had and some of the powers and the characters that we saw in those early issues were clearly designed to be weird, off-brand, maybe even one-off jokes. And now we're getting to a point where they're treating it as a more traditionally heroic superhero team, a more quote-unquote normal or more normative series for the 1960s. And we're seeing less of the weird character glitches. Sunboy is no longer a jerk all the time.
Right.
Starboy is no longer racked with guilt and probably won't be again until the 80s. And characters like Phantom Girl and Triplicate Girl, who in their initial appearances were pretty active and straightforwardly heroic in and of themselves, are now being kind of slid aside to secondary roles as, Ultra Boy's girlfriend in Phantom Girl's case, or the one who can turn into threes. And the powerful heroes, the most powerful Legionnaires, your Mon-El, your Ultra Boy, and your Superboy, are the ones who get the most action sequence in this issue. And I think that it's noteworthy that they are the only ones deemed most powerful or powerful enough to face the Time Trapper. And also it's hilarious that they do it by ramming into the Iron Curtain of Time with their heads.
With their heads. Okay, so here's something that's a big stretch. We are in the 1960s.
Yes.
We are starting to get into the I reject your conservative society backlash that goes on. And we want to start to embrace the weird. 1963, the X-Men are introduced.
Yes.
And the X-Men really turned Marvel Comics around.
No. The early X-Men, they were an utter failure.
Well, but still there was this thing that, here's Professor Xavier wanting to fight for peace and equality, and we've got a really diverse cast of characters, and there's craziness going on. So yes, while it wasn't until 10 years, 15 years, not even 15 years.
74, 75 is when the X-Men actually turned into the things that we're talking about here. Yeah.
But still, we have a book that takes off for Marvel and is doing really well. We also have Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, and whatever title that, I think it's just Spider-Man at the time. We've got a kid that has, this incredible Parker luck that is always getting him into trouble, even when he's, things should be going right for him. We also have the introduction of the Doom Patrol in 1963, which again, this really weird outcast of characters that are going and doing these amazing things. And here we have the Legion of Clubhouse, or the Legion of Superheroes, which is beating these guys by 10 years, that have weird, outrageous, quote-unquote outcast characters like we see in Doom Patrol and Spider-Man and X-Men. And suddenly the series, which could have, if they'd stopped doing these kinds of things like they're doing with the girls and with with Bouncing Boy, could have been the underground, we got to read this stuff. Even though Superman is one of those people that we disapprove of because he's part of the system, these Legion of Superheroes cats really got it going because they embrace everyone who is different and appealing. And instead, DC is starting to turn them, as you said, into a normative group of kids, which seems to be counter to the counterculture movement going on.
Agreed, but it is an indicator of the Legion's popularity as a feature, because they're being pushed back into more traditional stories, more traditional roles, because I think as it became clear that more people are reading this, DC is like, oh, well, we need to get our normal guys doing their normal stuff.
Yeah, I know. It just seems like a missed opportunity.
It is a major missed opportunity. And the fact that Bouncing Boy is depowered this issue and is out for the next 20.
Wait, say that again? He's out for how many issues?
20. Bouncing Boy
20
loses his
issues.
power in this issue and does not get them back until the 340s, and doesn't get them back permanently until after issue 350, because I think they were trying to sidetrack him as a strange or useless or offbeat character. And the fact that he's also the one Legionnaire who is heavier, probably one of the only characters in comics in the 60s who is heavier, is a side effect. I mean, it's not intentional. They're not saying fat guys can't play.
Are they? Because that's what they're doing.
That is what they're doing, but that's not what I think they intended to do. I think they intended to take a character with a power that was whimsical and silly and sidetrack him so that they could tell the more serious stories with your time trappers and your Glorious and your blood and your guts and your computos of conquering.
Do you think if these creators were alive today,
they'd be 120 and they don't talk like this?
They'd all be like, if these creators were alive today, or if they were able to travel to the future in a time bubble and kind of see what society is right now and see what people are, fighting for, and, the representation and diversity and all of these things, do you think that Edward Hamilton or Jerry Siegel would go back to 1964 and go, wait a minute, we shouldn't be doing this because we could be altering the future and really making a progressive step forward in our comics by embracing this now, because that's what people in the future are going to be talking about and people are going to be into? Or would they just say, nah, let's just talk about, normal stuff? Do you think that they would? Do you think they would see the quote unquote error of their ways, or do you think they would just be like, hey, they're just writing me a paycheck?
I think Siegel would. I believe that if you read about Siegel and the things that, especially the things that Siegel later claimed to intend when he created Superman and the Superman type stories, I think he absolutely would. Siegel was definitely a character who wanted that brighter, shinier universe where everybody had a place and everybody had something that they could contribute and nobody was going to be left out or beaten down. But I don't know enough about Ed Hamilton to say that he would, but I would say that my expectation of 60s escapist fiction and science fiction type writers
Mm-hmm.
is that Hamilton would probably be into that as well. Because even though we have those, this is too dangerous for a girl moments, we also have those things where they're like, here in the future, we no longer have economic equality, and we have all of these, things that are greater and better. I don't know that he would necessarily, from the perspective of 1964, say, for instance, a diversity of heroes and diversity of gender and diversity of ethnicity is something that he would necessarily immediately want to bring back to 1964. But I think he'd be
Well,
behind it.
yeah, and I say when we say diversity, we have to remember that we have a Durlan, a Kulin, a Saturn person, but we don't have any black characters yet, and this is 1964.
That's a thing. In 1964, you can give them half credit for creating characters who are blue and orange and green.
Mm-hmm.
But by 1967 or 1968, that credit has well and truly been used up. And the fact that it was 1976 before we saw a person who was actually a living, human, breathing character who is not Caucasian or Caucasian adjacent in the case of like a green Brainiac 5 with blonde hair.
Right.
You really have to ask yourself, was that intentional? Was that an echo of society, or was that an editorial decision to not challenge people with that sort of thing? So,
well,
I think that especially in a science fiction context, it's really disingenuous to say, well, we have blue people, so that's the same thing. It's not.
Right.
I will give them credit for it. And, Edmund Hamilton was one of the guys who came out of the weird tales and the amazing stories era of the 30s and 40s. And I think that just based on the people that he hung out with, your Otto Binders and your Julie Schwartzes and the people who came out of that group, I kind of feel like Edmund Hamilton would entirely be behind the positive changes in terms of representation in his stories. Now, whether he could get away with it and still collect a paycheck in 1964, that's really entirely going to be speculative on our part. So
yeah, I've got some different theories on that, but we'll have to save it until Tyrock's appearance in 1976, which
right. Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes number 273. Join us in 2021. It will be Legion Clubhouse episode 217, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, it's going to be interesting when we talk about that character, because on the one hand, yay, but on the other hand, oh boy, what did you guys do? We've come to the end of another Legion Clubhouse, Matthew, and what have we learned this week?
We've learned that if three girls are competing for your affections, you're probably an utter schmuck and none of them really like you.
I think we also learned that Star Trek stole a lot from the Legion of Superheroes.
And most importantly, we learned that if you're going to fight an unbeatable foe, do it with your head. Just go face first into the future, and if you can't crush it with your mighty forehead, well, then you're not from Krypton or Daxam.
And should be noted that you can't break the Legion of Superheroes' will, even if you employ tickle fighting.
Well, of course not. The tickle fight is a random part of every Saturday night at the Legion Clubhouse. But we can't show those stories yet because it's still 1964.
That wraps it up for this installment of the Legion Clubhouse. Thank you so much for checking us out and being a part of our adventures. We would love to see the Legion Clubhouse continue, and you can help us out by heading over to patreon.com/Major Spoilers. Every little bit helps, and we thank all of the cool spoilerites who have made this show happen so far, and we want to see more of you in the future. So until next time, I can't believe they did that, guy.
And I'm Guacamole Boy.
The Legion Clubhouse is a production of Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC, and is produced by Steven Schleicher. Your hosts were Matthew Peterson and Steven Schleicher. You can follow Matthew at Mighty King Cobra and Steven at Major Spoilers. You can follow this podcast on Twitter at Legion Clubhouse. If you have questions or comments, send them to podcast@majorspoilers.com. I'm Jason Inman. Until next time, eat it, Grandpa.
This podcast is copyright 2017 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.